Good time zone, everybody, and welcome to Horde of Tales. My name is Markus, also known as the Chindividual. I am a pale Caucasian male with short brown hair, a dark beard, glasses, and today in a dark green t-shirt with the Women of D&D logo, now known as Women of TTRPG. And I am here today for an ethereal conversation with two fantastic people to talk about Aether and Seekers of the Heart mini-campaign. I will let those people introduce themselves here, passing it first over to Angela. Hello there, Angela.
Hello there. Hello there. It's an absolute pleasure to be back here on Horde of Tales. My name is Angela Lemos Mogrovejo. I use she, her pronouns. I am a brown-skinned Latina with bits of redness in my skin that is, some of it is just acne flare-up because acne is a pain in the ass, with a bob of black hair that goes down just a little bit above my shoulders, and who is wearing a black bra that is currently being covered over by a orange sequin collared shirt that I'm wearing as well, and I'm wearing a pair of purple, very broad, translucent glasses. So that is me. I will pass it on over to our fantastic Eldritch.
Hi, I'm Eric, aka EldritchCrow on the internet. I am another pale Caucasian male with dark brown hair, though mine is, swept over to one side. I'm wearing dark glasses and a blue t-shirt with a bit of facial hair that is actually growing in for once. And yeah, I'm just here to generally be a menace. I'm glad to be back on the show, and I'm super excited to get to chat with y'all.
Awesome. Great to have both of you with us today. I was really looking forward to this conversation as it started as an idea that we had in the chat of one of the Seekers of the Heart games. And now we get to be together, the three of us, because I think we have a very interesting and cool situation here as we have the author of Aether here with us, who we also talked to on an earlier creator talk. And we have the GM of Seekers of the Heart, our Aether limited campaign that we ran in April and May on our Horde of Tales channel, which was filled with dramatic characters, fantastic action, and big, great emotions, which all culminated in a fantastic finale that, completely personally speaking, as a viewer of that entire thing, left me wanting for a little bit more. And what it also left me wanting for was to have a talk with some of the people involved in that. So for today's ethereal conversation that we're going to have, I want to have a conversation with both Eldritch, aka Eric, and Angela about how they experienced the system, how the system facilitated the story that was told at the table, and how also as an author of a TTRPG, how it feels to see your own game being played by new people and seeing it out in action in the field. But before we get to all of that, I want to start at the beginning. And from my experience as a GM, the beginning of a campaign is a phase full of ideas and concepts, and I can imagine, especially when you're trying out a game like Aether, you read the rules of the game, you see what the system can do, you're inspired not just by the rules of the game, but you also bring your own ideas to the table. And I want to start out the conversation with the question to Angela. Your campaign setting for this limited campaign of Aether, what inspired you for this specific setting, this world that we've seen in Seekers of the Heart?
Before you start, I have a follow-up question to that after this.
Oh, excellent. I'm excited already with the follow-up. Umbra, which for the most part came about as wanting to do a take on fantasy that felt very distinct to the kind of background that I come from. And also it came from wanting to respond to a history of aesthetic choices and narrative choices that often happened in like Western fantasy takes and like JRPGs and also RPGs that the West has done, of wanting to look in all seriousness at how we think about light, dark, and the corresponding elements that have over time become associated and connected with those things of blackness and whiteness. It came from this interest of thinking about very often like the kind of people who are treated as the agents of history, the ones who create and move forward and in a way get to be the heroes of a tale. This is a point that's been reiterated by a bunch of other like POC creators and such. But for me, it's a point that always bears repeating, is that the people who you treat as being capable of doing heroics or their perspectives are entertained seriously reveal a lot about who counts as human, as subhuman, as worthwhile people to care about, both in terms of their backstories, but also the complexities to their character. So a lot of Umbra came out of that sort of philosophical engagement with the overall genre that I work in, which is that I love fantasy. I love thinking about magic, about technology, about the intersection of those, and how cultures are created around that. Like in a world, how do you make a thing real? Because for me, one of the things that I struggled with growing up about something like a Lord of the Rings or a very world building heavy kind of piece of media was that I'm like, I don't do descriptions well, or rather, I don't think I do visual descriptions well, which anyone listening to this who's been at my tables will be like, what the fuck are you talking about? But for me, the visual has always been very difficult to talk about. So I've focused a lot on smells and sound because that's how I move through the world. That's how I process it. And Umbra kind of came about from wanting to look at a different perspective for how people might think of a world that frankly came about from playing Hollow Knight, the first original Hollow Knight, for like a couple of hours and being enamored with this sense of overgrown beauty, of living, thriving beauty, because there's so much in the natural world that I love, because there's places where I've looked up where I'm like, how would I create a Bloodborne like scenario? And then I look at places in Germany or in Hamburg and I'm like, that's what I do for Bloodborne. I just create these streets in there. But then there's also places like, how do I make a world mountain make sense? For me, it was Bolivia. It was a lot of growing up with a family who came from South America and from Mexico and seeing what it meant to look at the mountain and earth, not to put it too stereotypically as like people of the earth, but like concepts of like people of the sun, people who have lived in the high plains, or what's often referred to as like altiplano, like folks who are thinking about the world as related to mountains. So Umbra came from a lot of different places, but it came from a mix of Hollow Knight aesthetics, loving mountains and the beauty of them and nature, and also just wanting to respond to how people typically look at fantasy like media.
Fascinating.
That's wonderful. And I feel like my follow-up question actually plays into that a bit, because I've been curious, when you picked up Aether, was there a moment for you reading the system or talking about the system where you went from, oh, this is neat, to, oh, I need to run this, and feeling Umbra kind of click into place with the system?
I think some of it came about from the moment I was seeing the components about goals, values, but especially omens, because omens is such a simple concept that folks, I think as GMs, because this is essentially a conversation between three people who have probably been always GM in a lot of contexts. It's only very recently in the past few years I've become more of a player than a GM. But what I've always found a lot of GMs do is that, like, in order to specialize a part of the narrative to make it like unique to a given player, like they'll tell you something like, oh yeah, my parents, like my character hasn't seen them in like 7 years, but like they're not dead or anything. I just don't know what's happened to them. And then you'll be like, I'm gonna leave a pin on that one. Gonna come back to that. Oh look, we're going into the first layer of the Nine Hells, for example. Like if you're doing D&D sort of stuff. Yeah, they made a bad deal with the devil. Hey, Amelia. By the way, your mom and dad are over there. They're having a conversation with the devil. Like that's the kind of thing that just does happen. Like GMs do that kind of thing, I think, by reflex. But to have it mechanized in a way that not only encourages people to lean into the drama of the story, but more importantly, to have it mechanized in a way that's positive for everybody. Because that's a recurring theme of a lot of what I liked about Aether was this sense of collaboration. Because what I've seen in a couple of OSR inspired games that I've played, and especially in the tradition of 5e in the oral tale actual play tradition that's come up throughout Twitch in the past years, there is a tendency to try and accidentally create, for a lot of players, main character syndrome. And like there is a difference between that and also like just taking the spotlight. There is a difference between that, because I think naturally a table lends itself to collaborating and building each other's stories up. But I think there was a moment in that where I thought, okay, I was already sold on this because it wasn't using dice, it was using cards. That already was very intriguing to me, especially thinking about like a mixed success approach that wasn't doing dice, because I'm not used to seeing as many games that do that. But for me, it was a lot of the narrative tools that felt like it sold a lot of the, oddly, the cultural values that matter a lot to me, of like, not to reiterate again a false dichotomy of like collectivist versus individualist, because across any given nations, across any given regions, those are they're an inadequate set of terms to try and capture things. But the idea of coming from a cultural perspective that is very much has the family unit thinking of multiple people with specific roles and interacting with one another, where you can't just think of yourself as an individual, you are always slotted into a system of interlocking parts. That was kind of the moment where I was like, I think this will work for Umbra, because I was looking desperately for doing something like Umbra for a fantasy system. And I went to the other system that I did consider for this was Heroic Chord, which is a relatively recent game too, that I will find a place to run this fucking game. I have been wanting to run that game for a year, and I've been wanting to run Aether for months. But long and the short of it, that moment, Omens, I think, sold me. How it was mechanized and written, that sold me on, this is perfect for this world.
I have for the
Awesome.
for the Omens part, I do actually have a question or point of discussion for a later part in today's conversation. And that makes me glad that you mentioned the Omens, because it also makes me glad because I think I understand how seeing mechanics lining up with the ideas that you have for a setting, there's like immediately that resonance between the game part and the narrative part. And from my experience as a GM, it's always extremely satisfying when the rules in a game really support the fiction that you're seeing before you when you're prepping your game.
Fun fact, that feeling is why I specifically state in the opening pages of Aether that it is a rule book, not a lore book. I did my best to actually peel any mentions of pre-created lore out of it to try and open up more angles for that feeling to come into play. So, just a fun thing.
Great. That's really great. And once you have an idea of the campaign world you want to play in, once you know the rules you want to use to that, you start assembling your players for your table. And those players, they're going to make characters. And I personally, as a GM, I'm always a big fan of character creation sessions. To me, they're always like this little bit of a creative brainstorm, and to have a chance to see what kind of characters start being created and prepared for this game. And I want to start out, Eric, when you wrote Aether and play tested Aether. How did you approach character creation in the game? Especially, what was your goal at character creation, and how did it go when you first started testing the game?
When it came to character creation, you know, before I started writing Aether, um, my only experience with TTRPGs was D&D. And I always felt like D&D was a very mechanics first character creation system where my video game and number loving brain was always like, okay, it was always picking aspects of character based on the mechanics or based on the numbers associated. I was like, okay, I want to step away from that a little bit because the point of Aether was kind of my answer to, okay, I like certain things, I like the customization elements and all this stuff, but in the D&D games I've played, everyone has always wound up caring about their characters and caring about each other's characters because I was playing with a consistent group for a number of years at that point. So we were all really close out of game, and that kind of lends itself to investing in each other's gameplay experience. And I wanted to codify that. But I realized that I couldn't really do a mechanics first approach. So I did my best to do all right, your character is a person first. They live a life that is going to be part of this story, and they have the skills and abilities as a result of that life. Let's build it out from there. And so in the character creation segment of the game, you'll see it starts with, all right, what's kind of your base concept? How do your skills stem out from that concept? So on and so forth. And it was very broad, but in the sense of like, okay, you need to come to the system with an idea, and the system will tell you how to sort of bring that idea to fruition within itself. So character creation, when I did the playtest stream, was very much, and again, the playtest stream was, different versions of the game, rules were shifting around, but the basic idea was, all right, here's my concept for the setting. Let's ballpark some ideas for characters and what we want to do. And then let's look at the, actual character creation segment of the game and figure out how do we take your idea from an idea to a person, and then figure out the mechanics after. And that was it.
Basically, starting fiction first and then working to the mechanics from there. Angela, how did that in the character creation session for Seekers of the Heart? How did you also start working first from the fiction, or were there some players who saw certain character features that were like, oh, I really want to have that feature, or I want to start it from the mechanical angle? How did character creation go for the Seekers of the Heart game?
It was a mix of different things where I could tell going in and immediately from like the first and second session, someone like Caro, who was one of the players at the table, had a very much like, okay, here's a new thing. I'm gonna go poke and prod around what I can do on the extremes of this. And I love that kind of player because they immediately take all the things that you have expectations about in regards to how to approach the dreaded word of balance in any sort of combat game, because balance is just a thing that we kind of, it's a theoretical ideal, but you kind of have to toss it aside sometimes and, treat it like it's magic. I don't have to justify this and make shit up. You kind of have to take that approach to it sometimes. So there
Balance
were
is a
some
soft magic system.
Yeah, it balances. Yes, actually, yes. But there is an element where like having someone like that lets me see, okay, initially there were just some sketches of like character elements that I wanted to pull at for Caro's character of Juville, who came to be like a beloved character in the group for hot boy dragon reasons and other reasons. But then there was someone like Nikki who I think wasn't able to make the first session, but came with such an interesting idea of like trying to ground their character in the world sketches that I'd given them. Because I literally, when I did this character creation for my players, I can't really run a new system without making a new world. It just keeps happening. I don't try to do that, but it's just sort of how I process, like, having the system make sense to me is just letting it breathe life into something else. And then I usually give my players like an outline of what different components could be involved in that. So for example, for Umbra, I literally took inspiration from Dante's Purgatorio, where the actual mountain sort of design being like a slow ascension to paradise of different themes and such of what would be there. I gave them an outline of what I was thinking of, and I just and of different like themes or of different sins or the negation of certain sins from the original text, and was like, here, where would your character live? Like, what would it be like there for them to embody an aspect of that? And then just see what they did with it. Character creation flowed from there, where folks were like, oh, I think my character was a lot closer to the top. They're probably used to hearing about some of this stuff and dealing with like gardening around there. Whereas other people were like, there is no light where I live. I live in a layer that's just chaotic pirates. Like,
I am a cave goblin.
yeah, exactly. I am a cave gobbo. My existence is chaos. And truly, that's a statement that defines many a player I've interacted with at my tables.
What's nice here as well is what you mentioned here, that also what kind of layer from Umbra the characters came from. I think that also granted us as viewers of the campaign already in the first session quite of a nice little look at the different layers as we were introduced to the characters. Like, where's this character from? We had all these little bits where every character had their own starting scene, and we were introduced to basically like, what's it like in that part of Umbra? What's it like over there? And that already also established the world a bit more through the characters that were in the group.
Yeah, and that wasn't. Oh, sorry. No, go ahead.
Sorry,
go.
I was just going to interject and say that, like, by far my favorite part of the entire series is the character intros, just because of how strange and fresh and new they all felt. Even Nikki's character coming in session 2, you know, getting that first introduction to this character is basically a giant stone golem. But also they were just fantastic with each little, you know, vignette and each little sort of piece of information and location we got. So
No, yeah, and that was intentional, because some of the things that I found, it's a habit I've picked up from having God, it's been like I think 2-3 years now at this point of running a Slayers game for the first time over on another channel, where I literally gave my players, because we had 4 sessions to work with there, and I was like, this story needs to be really tight and focused ish, otherwise we're not getting anything done here. I wanted to showcase my players' creativity, because I think a lot of the time GMs, I think, get a bad rap for like getting for folks, I think, having this association that like they have god complexes or other things. It's like, no, I think actually what one of the symptom like underlying reasons for the tendency for GMs to have to like overcorrect and exert more control is because we forget that the GMs are also a player, and so they want to show off the world that they've created, the stuff that they've done, just as much as the players want to do. And part of what for me has been healthier, I think, for my own well-being, because I'm the kind of person who literally for a home game, I spent 25 hours in a week statting multiple or fey creatures that I just pulled from 3.5 and 4th edition, because I was like, I looked at the fey stat lines for what was available at the time. I think I screamed some form of a string of obscenities because they were lacking, and I thought, you know what, I'll do it myself. Part of what I didn't want to do again with any other series was to have that come up again, that sort of obsessive need to overcorrect, and instead trust my players to create their own mess for themselves, to remove a lot of that work for me, And some of that has meant I have to be less possessive of the way that I see my world and bring them into it, because in ultimately, yes, they are playing by the sort of like underlying structural rules of the worlds that we as GMs create, but the what people are going to see in an actual play performance context are the character stories. And so what's a simpler and more efficient way to get that across than to have them build out sections of the world, to have it be like, okay, you live in this world. What is the place you live in like? Who are the people you're connected to? And that was also another reason why I liked Aether for this, because your bond specifically said it could be a place that matters to you or a person. And to me, that was so wonderful, because it meant you can't do the individualistic. I use the term murder tourist because I think murder hobo gives a bad rap to a lot of folks who are like homeless or struggling. Murder tourist is more accurate because folks would just go kill a bunch of people and like, you're the heroes. I'm like, we just committed serial murder here. And it's like, well, you solved the problem. That was not the intent. And I kind of wanted to break with that and have it be like, well, what do you stand for? Some folks, it was Chaos Pirate kind of wants to just stop an abusive ex. Another person was, I don't know who I am. I want to figure out what's going on. Another person was, my home's under threat. Another person, I kind of want to get back to my stage work. We had such distinct stories come out of just a simple idea of like, what do you value? What's where you live like?
Fantastic. Yeah. And just for the record, I am totally going to use murder tourist as a term from now on, because it's way better than any other term. Like murder tourist really describes the connotation you're going for. No, but great how you also loop back that also the bonds that you establish in the rules of Aether, how those also facilitate then the world building that you then show. And interesting point you raise also of the GM being a player at the table, and by allowing other people to bring in their own stuffs to the world, also getting less possessive of the world, because I think that's a very interesting and important element in world building, that if you all do it by yourself, every little bit in the world is your child, and you care, like you care on a different level for all those elements. If other people also contribute, you can also, of course, you still care about those elements, but there's also other people now in the setting who care about these specific things because they brought them into the game.
I also just realized that I need to add a line into the narrator's toolkit intro for Aether, which is just trust the mess. It's like, trust the mess. Like, let the mess happen. It will resolve itself. Just trust the mess. I feel like that's a thing. It's a really simple summary of a thing that, like, once you've GM'd enough, you hit a break point where it's like, okay, I cannot keep pulling my hair out over every little detail. I just gotta let it go and let this shenanigans happen. And Aether at its core kind of revolves around that idea of like, just let the shenanigans happen. You know, players one shot your boss, that's fine. There's always ways to make it work. And so just, yeah, I gotta add that in there. Just because I feel like Seekers of the Heart was a fantastic example of just trusting the mess, where you have these very disparate characters being brought together by a thing, and very disparate like individual storylines that wrapped around each other into an extremely emotional payoff. To the point where I'm pretty sure, am I correct in thinking that one of those big emotional beats is now an award-winning emotional beat?
At least nominated.
It was at least nominated, which
exactly.
I couldn't remember if I saw that it had reached the finals or if it had like won the award for it.
I think it did reach the finals. I do know
finals.
that one for sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, like you managed to knit these individual stories together so well collectively as a group, and then just letting that big crit moment happen is wonderful.
If
It was
my
wonderful.
expression during the finale did not convey it enough, that was not planned. Nikki did not mention any of that, expecting that to happen. There was talk of like, I don't know what Sonorum wants to do for the end, because Sonorum fundamentally as a character didn't really want Ultima to like suffer. And that was
Right.
kind of my goal, is that I like creating villains. Sometimes I like creating villains where it's very clear this is an asshole. Sometimes you just got to include a person who, look, I am not a violent person by any means. I'm more often than not a pacifist. However, there are some people who I wish nothing but the very deepest pits of hell, or at least the abyss.
Yeah.
Alaric was one of those characters.
Yeah. Sometimes you need the dickhead so that they are cathartic in their defeat.
Yeah.
But then there's also Sonorum and Ultima, which is cathartic in its own right.
Yeah, where it was literally our final boss was someone who, and there was a period where, full disclosure, I had not thought about the Memoria narrative element for a while, but thinking about it in terms of like in the moment of like the last couple of episodes, thinking it over again, I was like, no, this makes sense, in that someone who was so close to them and didn't want a friend to have to pay the price, that frankly a lot of how I see in the general, to use the dreaded word of discourse, talks about like sacrifice, is that it's like, yes, we'll do this and like no one will talk about it again. And I'm like, no, there's some people who like live with the impact of that weight for ages. Sometimes their families are there's a thing for I'm surprised it took me this long to mention Final Fantasy 14, but there's a thing in one of the expansions where in the post-patch content you interact with people from the nation that have been the citizens involved in a centuries-long war with dragons. And you beat, quote unquote, the big bad guys, and the post patches are like, no, not everything is perfectly fine. Their church is in shambles. People are constantly on edge about whether or not you should even have a peace with the dragons, because some people are trying to push that forward.
Right.
The weight of history, the weight of consequence, and what burdens we ask heroes, quote unquote, to bear shouldn't be overlooked, because like, and again, I'm careful around this because I don't want this to be used for the wrong kind of people. Insert Nazis don't get this exclusion because they're Nazis. They deserve a punch to the face and a second punch to the face. But the heroes that we talk about, the kinds of folk in our oral traditions that are held up as examples of lessons, it's an obvious sentiment, but they were also people in a lot of ways. Part of what connects them to us is the humanity. It's the sense of how we see ourselves and also how we don't see ourselves. And to see someone, literally your final boss is like, what is this? It's a fallen angel, it's a banshee, it's a terrible elemental wielding like agent of destruction. It's like, yes, it's also someone who literally cannot let go of friends who gave up some of their physical and mental well-being in order to ensure their home was safe. That's not something that's going to be easy to pass over, and I didn't want people to pass over it.
That is definitely also something that was really clear in the way that was presented in the game as well. And also great to see how the players picked up on it and wove their characters also into the part of that narrative. So really strong tonal presentation there as well. So great to see. And I have, sorry, go ahead.
I don't mean to interrupt, but I want to stick on this, final boss battle Ultima moment for just a second, because Anila, you did this amazing thing, and I don't know if you're aware that you did it, but you managed to nest with, with the interaction of the players and everything, you managed to nest this very emotional through line of this unknowable, almost biblical, angelic figure, and gave them this emotional through line, but you managed to start off demonstrating it via a boss fight, and you managed to tell that story through that and have the players pick up on it. That all led up to that crit moment. So for you, what was it like conceiving of that boss fight, and what were your end goals for it? Like, what were you trying to pull out of the players with that boss fight?
So the baseline for any time I have a final sort of conflict to end a series or a last big event or moment is to, in a lot of ways, come back to something that I think both your system stresses and also to me has mattered a lot as a game designer, which is player agency. Because there's an element throughout Aether of often like being able to choose when you get experience or choose when to take certain like consequences that could facilitate you bringing upon yourself an omen or a dramatic moment. And again, that was another thing that I really liked was that omens are not, they don't have to be bad, because folks think the only way you can do an interesting story is if you have bad things happen to you. No, you can just have like a dramatic change because people go through positive changes in their life. But keeping that in mind, a lot of what I've always liked in boss conflicts is that I love turn moments, because some of what I've seen in the games that I love, whether it's something like Hades, whether it was the final boss fight for Kingdom Hearts 2, or even Kingdom Hearts 1, as long as the Kingdom Hearts 1 final boss fight is, there's this just growing sense of like the scenery is changing around you. The mechanics of what the order of things as they were before just shifts entirely. I wanted to give that sense of scope and history to how see their world, because also like even just creating the 5 zones for that, I wanted to give I always like the idea that that came from the Numenera system, which is a Monty Cook game system that it's D20 based, but it's built around this idea that you are constantly looking for fragments of the past. You are super advanced in everything, but it's like your past technology that you uncover is the weirdest shit in the world, and it's some of the most advanced things you could ever find. I like doing that narratively, where you imply that this world is not solely confined to the players. This world has so much beyond it. It has histories and ages beyond what we normally talk about. But you don't need to do that and then just bore people with a lecture. You can do that with showing different people what they've walked into, because that's one of those awkward things that you have to kind of you come to a realization about with your character. Or I think as you play more games, I found people playing more complex and mature characters, that's the thing they realize, is that you are not an individual. Because there's a lot of the video game mindset, there's a lot of the like, I'm going to make this one because I want to play my favorite trope, and it's like, oh, that's cool, lean into tropes are really good. Tropes are just shorthand, and there's nothing wrong with playing an overdone trope, because you
They're
can
a
always
great starting point.
Exactly. But part of what I've found that's interesting about seeing new takes on stuff is just seeing like how you end up being connected to other people in history. And that whole last fight was, for me, that it was a lot of me admittedly getting some of my frustration from Savage raiding from FF14 out of my head, because some of the mechanics for a couple of the attacks were literally just pulled from a raid fight I was struggling with for 2 months to clear, and just being like, you know what, my players should deal with this. I'm tired of dealing with this with just my team. My players should deal with this. But some of it also was just, and this is admittedly where this does require a little bit of background knowledge of like the channel also being host to an Eberron campaign. Part of it was wanting to represent a kind of love letter and appreciation to the folks on the channel, because I literally asked Markus to help me make a character who had a story, who would be involved in the narrative, and then make cool things around them, which is why I gave them a fucking Gale and an Earth Hammer, because Markus was
Nice.
like, a mall. And I'm like, cool. The baseline is a mall. The rest of it is a giant warhammer formed from Earth. That's just cool. But some of it was just, I wanted to give thanks and appreciation for the folks who give me chances to like share my stories, who look at someone being like, I want to do a subterranean mountain world. And they're like,
Sure.
all right, let's go. Sure. That's I'm a very direct person in a lot of ways, despite being very skittish for a lot of other reasons. And for that final battle, it was just a mix of like, I want to do a cool big impact fight. I want to get the most out of a system. And I also just want to treat it as the culmination of all these different tensions that are happening. Because that is a thing that for me, my favorite games have done. They do those turns, they do those second phase. You're playing Hades, you beat the final boss, and then the music does a big shift, and you're like, oh no, he has a second health bar. God damn it. Or those moments where, to not spoil too many things from a later expansion in FF14, there's a boss fight in there where the first form is you're fighting a character who's ascended to a minor form of godhood. Midway through the fight, she drops to a human form, and the additional enemies you fight are all specters of grief and trauma that have haunted her whole life, that she's willingly asking to attack her so that the harm will refuel her back to her state of godhood. That's so much story being told through the context of a fight. That is mechanics and combat fueling the flavor and the fiction. And to me,
Yeah.
that to me is the peak of what a combat done well, or at least made interesting, is like. It's the like Dragon Ball Z, My Hero Academia. It's a lot of like those kinds of tropes of like the shonen kind of comic thing where you're like, it's not just this person does a cool thing. It's this person, like, here's my short way of putting it. I like Guts from Berserk as a character. Guts on paper sounds boring as shit. It's just like he's a dude who wields a sword that's too big for him, and he has armor that hurts him. That sounds like a terrible pitch for a character. You go to any Berserk fan and you have them talk about any of the fights he's been in, the brutality, the heaviness, the willingness of what he's willing to let happen to him just to get an edge. All of those say so much about his story without having to be a lecture.
And I think what you mentioned in there a few times was also that the mechanics also of the game supported that, what you were going to do. And I think therein lies also a good segue into the topic of mechanics of the game. Because when we're talking about tabletop RPGs, we need to talk about the mechanics of the game, because that's what they are under the hood. And for Aether, we're just going to put the cards on the table because we're literally using cards for this game. And I wonder, in practice, Eric, when you started designing the game, how fast did you know that you wanted to use cards instead of dice for this game?
Not very. That's the best way I could put it. It took the version of Aether I consider 1.0 is technically the second iteration of the game. It's not like the 1.0 everybody can go and try out and buy and all that stuff is technically a 2.0, because the original 1.0 was a dice pool game. And then I hit a brick wall math-wise, and I was working on a one-pager, which was just an idea for like a one-page dueling game using card suits. And then figuring out that core resolution, and then I looked over at this big project that I had hit a brick wall on, and I'm like, God damn it. I have to go put this card resolution system into this dice pool game. Okay. and then just yank out the guts and internals of the system and rebuild them from the ground up. And now we have what we have. So it took a while. It took probably about 6 months before it shifted into a card-based game. But then once it shifted in that direction, it picked up the pace pretty quick. Just because it simplified a lot of things and it allowed me to do more interesting things. Like my favorite personal little tidbit of mechanics is the card bank, which is why it's going to get much more of a focus in the next version as well. Just because I'm like, I love the idea of actively just being able to move resources around and sort of almost playing a resource management game in the middle of your combat sim. Uh, in terms of like, yes, you do this skill check, but also you're going to want to borrow a little bit of that luck for later. Just go stash that.
I want to quickly hook in on that card bank thing, because I actually had in my notes when we would talk about mechanics was the card bank thing. Because when we had our first conversation, we were just starting the Seekers of the Heart game. We didn't have that many examples yet. But now I've seen the card mechanic in action a lot more, and especially the bank. And one thing it reminded me of was how you would build certain decks in a game like Slay the Spire, like a deck building roguelite game. And that is, to me, just also a very interesting feeling that gives. That I can say like, okay, I have this card here, but I'm not going to use it now. I'm going to put it in my bank, and at a moment that is convenient for me, this will be, well, my not entirely literal ace up my sleeve, but that card that can change the outcome of something in the future, giving you a lot of narrative control.
Yeah, it's amazing what you can do when you go through and you say, okay, I just got a crit on a skill check that I do not care about. So I'm just going to save that for later.
Yeah.
The amount of things that opens up is probably my least expected and most thrilling discovery over the course of actually playing the system. Because in my original playtesting, someone, and I don't remember who it was, asked, "Oh, can we like spend the resources to bank a crit?" And I sat there and I was like, I didn't write a rule against it, so go ahead. It's one of those things where Aether is very much a system of, if there's nothing explicitly against it, there's probably rules for you to figure out how to do it instead. And there's very little that I actively like restrict in the system too. The only blatant thing I restrict is like if people are making their own content, I give a couple of guidelines and I say no mind control.
Yeah.
That's it. Those are the only two things in the rules I can think of that I actively say, okay, just don't. But other than that, like, yeah, you never really think about the impact of a crit until you can choose it. There are those moments of like, yes, you'll pull a crit at an opportune moment, at random, and it'll feel really good. But how much better does it feel to sandbag one and then just wait 6 sessions and then have this, big epic moment and be like, oh yeah, the villain's doing a thing? I have this king stored. How about no? I've had that happen a few times in my home game, and it is always a wonderful time. So
I will say too, with that, there is an additional element that it also encourages, intentionally or not, in the players. That I think it part of the reason I really like Aether as like, there's been games that people tout as like a 5e like replacement kind of thing, and it's like there's always a discussion to be had about like, oh, a system can never fully replace all the things that another one does because they're often done with different mindsets and all this sort of stuff. One of the reasons I really like Aether as a good introduction of moving folks away from the miss-hit approach to games, which can feel a little bit like antagonistic in the wrong hands, is that element of like, well, yes, I could have a scenario where I draw a 5, a 9, and a king. All of those are technically a success. 9 still while high is still a mixed success. But it also encourages another thing in the players in terms of emphasizing their agency of being like, are you okay with not getting fully what you want for a later big moment? It kind of, whether intending to or not, teaches agency to the players and affirms their agency by being like, you know what, I don't want to get all of what I want right now, but I still want this to work out mostly in our favor. So I'm going to choose the 9, but I want to bank that king because later in a big moment, I want this to be like heavy. Yeah, and you need it. You're going to need it because there was a lot of moments like when they were the pirate ship that had been enchanted to fly across the gorge was about to crash into the ravine. It was like, I would like a king here, please. I would like to just not, there's a success here where we're not dealing with this crap. Like there's a lot of that kind of moment where it's like having a stored great like get out of jail free card is good, but it also means that you have to have moments where you're like, I'm a badass, but only kind of. And that's a good humbling experience, I think, that I think more systems shouldn't be worried about having, because I think you don't want to be a buzzkill to players when they want to do good stuff, because like it's nice to succeed. You have enough losses in your everyday life anyways, but I really like that element of what the card bank system also encouraged, is that players also have to be like, I suck a little bit more in this moment, but later on I'm going to be a badass. And that's that's good flavor for a fantasy genre game to have.
And that's one of those things where like I keep seeing it more and more. And it was kind of funny because when my home game first switched to it, you know, they were a little reticent to take partials when they could and bank crits for later. And now they're getting more used to it. And it's almost this process of like becoming comfortable with risk and realizing that risking failure, risking partial success does not have to be a bad or a negative thing. It can still be a driving force. And that's why a fun thing about, I'm still tinkering with writing wise, but I know one of my plans on the GM side of things for this next update is the GM is getting a card bank as well. So, just something to look forward to for later.
I do think that the card bank really is also a very good mechanic for giving more control on plot beats, of like just more control on the ups and down in a narrative. I mean, we can always like, everyone who's ever done a creative writing class knows like the waveform of a story, working up to a climax and then going down again and back up. And I think with the card bank, you give everyone, especially once there is a version where the GMs also have a card bank, everyone at the table this chance to have more control on the plot beats and the flow of the plot.
Yeah, and that's absolutely like one of the things for me running the system. It's like at this point, not to like tout my own horn here, but I'm a very good improviser. So there have been points where like I not to reveal this in a spot where my players could see it, but in the last big boss fight I had them do, which was like a big bell tower boss fight, I had a whole stat block worked up for that creature that I barely looked at because I knew the numbers on the sheet, and I was just like, okay, well, it makes sense they'd be able to do this, so they do this. And that was the thing. And then I wanted to give them, like, that was the fight that made me realize, oh wait, no, the narrator needs a card bank, because the narrator needs to be able to take moments and sort of push them into the more dramatic sense for adversaries as well. And it's totally not because in that boss fight I got entirely wrecked by my own status effects. But that's beside the point. That boss fight, by the way, ended in a spectacular example of why I love generic 3-action systems instead of like set types of actions on a turn, because in that boss fight, the creature started cutting the ropes to the bells. And so they were flying up to the ceiling and crashing through the floor that they were all fighting on because they were fighting in the upper portion of the bell tower. And then the creature tried to escape. And so while they were running, they were about to try and like dive off one of the last bells after cutting the rope and, letting the pulley system do its thing. And so with the action economy, one player stuck him to the bell, just used an attack and used a status effect to make sure that the creature couldn't move. So I was like, well, all right. So you described it as being like an alchemical arrow that, glued its hand to the bell. This creature was very, lichen-esque. So I was like, all right, the creature chews through its own wrist to move and nullify the status effect. And then was about to flee and was like on its last legs trying to run away. And one player the blood mage had sandbagged an action, and the player was like, oh, hey, I jump in and use the cleanse ability to remove a condition/wound and reattach his hand as the bell flies up to the ceiling. So they stuck the boss to the bell that it tried to use as a weapon and let him do himself in, basically, with a healing ability. It was amazing. And so I love that kind of thing. And that's the kind of thing where like, yeah, no, that's like, you let that happen, but I would have loved to have a card bank in my back pocket to be like, okay, that's fair. But maybe they just have a resource to at least survive the hit or keep going. Who knows? But no, it was a great time.
And that does sound like, especially the description of that fight sounds amazing. And if something like a card bank helps to facilitate that, all the better. Who doesn't want to have something that cool in their game? But I want to bank this conversation about the card bank for now. And I have looked at our portents, and we should still talk about omens, because we've mentioned omens a few times in this conversation, or pretty early on in the conversation. We already got excited about what omens meant and why we liked it. Angela, in the Seekers of the Heart game, how did you experience the omen mechanic?
Omens just felt like I didn't have to come up with the twists and the turns. I just had to come up with the approach of the twist and the turn, which was one of my favorite things. It removed so much stress in the planning stage for me as a GM, but it still gave me a lot of material to create very impactful moments. Go.
I was just gonna say, cannot tell you as a GM how much of my personal creative batteries it has saved having my players hand me plot beats.
Like there have been jokes that a lot of GMs have said about like, oh look, the player is handing me a knife with which to stab them with, like emotionally. And I'm like, there is that element to it, because there was definitely moments where for like Juvie, Caro gave me an element of like has to choose between protecting people or sacrificing the chance to get the body back. And I'm just like, this is not going to happen anytime soon. This is going to be like 3/4 of the way through. I just know this, but this is going to be waiting and seeing how different folks interacted, seeing how, frankly, Jenna and Caro sort of started playing off of one another's characters, and just seeing that kind of like the kind of joy everyone had about like different like body moments that would come up, body as in like akin to like loot as opposed to body physical form, although that kind of works in this case too. There was so much about omens that I enjoyed because it meant that they were these looming things to just sort of drop in and make impactful, not just for those individual characters, but to sort of change the dynamic of what had been going on before. Like Hector's character Esper had the whole thing with the like crystalline greatsword, where once it disappeared, it was like, that was like the boss killer for an earlier fight, and now it's gone. So now they had to rely on their staff more, which, you know, it didn't stop them because they're a paladin and paladins are broken, but they're correctly broken in the way that they should be. But there was a lot of these different moments where it became a sense of like testing the values of the characters, of getting more of a sense of like what mattered to them. Like the whole experience was so delightful. It was so good to have the stress relief of not having to come up with like, how do I make you question who you are as a person? Because that's always a very fun thing to do as a GM. It made it more of like, how do you flavor doing something like that? Because the whole thing, like, for example, with Caro's character of Juville, of like choosing between like being there for friends or being there for other people or choosing the body, that could very well have just been played as, oh, some folks are in danger. What are you going to do? And that would have been significant. That would have hit the mechanic just fine. But having it be a moment where Juville's literally like, no, this abusive ass motherfucker who literally is taking my body and rotting it as an undead, you're getting burned straight to oblivion, and I'm nuking you right now. But it pushing the limits of their body and basically being a sign that like, you're on borrowed time now, bud. That's a whole different emotional weight that's carried with that action. And that's facilitated by omens of just a starting point of like, you will need to make a choice. That was a lot for the different players. They all had a bunch of different other ones like that.
I have a behind the scenes question. Did all of the players know each other's omens? Were those like an open secret at the table for you?
Nope.
Ooh, nice.
I just literally have a doc that had all of their character concepts, and I had their stuff, and I just go back to it and be like, chaos. Choose this vial of chaos, put that in right here. This element of body horror with the theater. This element of why is she suddenly screaming like a dragon from a necklace in her neck, like hanging around her neck, you know, like you do.
As one does.
As one does. As a GM does.
I'm gonna sound terrible for this, but as a GM, I love to see the stress players feel as they look at that omen meter going up. Because it's like anytime an ace comes up, there's just that dread of them ticking off the box. And my players are all melodrama incarnate, so they almost exclusively hand me knives. I especially because like the system I'm running right now, or the game I'm running right now, is a gothic horror game, so they handed me not necessarily all negative like in the outset, but at least balanced out where they could all have negative results in terms of omens. So that's been a really fun experience as well. And I'm glad that they got to facilitate that kind of almost you relaxing into the position of narrator rather than you feeling more tension because of it.
That is also the impression I got from omens just from seeing them in action in the game, but also reading the omen mechanic in the rule books. I do like that it is something that keeps ticking up, and it is easily visualized at the table as well. I was like, oh, the omen encounter increases. We're getting closer to one of these coming into action. And just having a visual countdown. I mean, there's a reason why clock mechanics have become so popular in tabletop RPGs in recent years. It's an easily visualized concept of rules. It's ticking down to something and adds a little bit of tension at the table.
Also, if I may say, just as a quick interlude, I want to note that I appreciate Eric's version of Limit Break much better than I appreciate Animon Stories' version of Limit Break, because they also have one of those. Yours is better. Yours is far better, because their version takes too long to do. And it's just
Yeah,
it's
it
more
can
yours
it can
is
get
more
a
interesting.
little. Yeah, like limit breaks are one of those things where it's like, okay, I don't want you to be able to do it all the time, but like semi frequently.
Like I could have limit break as a treat.
Yeah, like just do the cool thing. We'll figure out the consequences later. It's fine. And that's my whole shtick with the system is like just do the thing.
Just do the thing and accept the chaos, right? Like we said earlier. Just trust in the mess.
Yeah, exactly. Just understand that okay, you're doing this cool thing now, and I will absolutely body you for it later. Don't worry about it.
Well, we
That's
mentioned
my whole process.
we mentioned game balance earlier, but ironically, there's also some kind of balance in that chaos somewhere that it comes and it goes.
I would say so too, because I would agree with that. Because as much as folks were like spamming, especially during the last fight, just smite, healing, getting myself wards by giving up in action. Oh, I gave them this ability, which gave them 10 additional wards or whatever else absurdity I gave them because I wanted them to have fun. I think there was something facilitated by the system that I also very much want to highlight, which is that it made people have fun with risks. And like I know Eric had already said that earlier, but there's an element to it that I wanted to highlight of like I have I've played with a group. I ran a game from level 1 to 20 for over 2.5 years. Never again, especially because it was a 6-person party. Never again. Just just never. Never try and fight a Circle of the Moon druid, a nature cleric, an ancient's paladin, a monk, and a couple of other people when all of them have high wisdom and you can't do sucker save throws, especially when a paladin's nearby. Yeah, I know, Markus, cry. That was me. But one of the things I found at times was that because they knew how hard I would hit with enemies just to be able to even do damage to them, because you have to as a result of the medley poor balancing for 5e at higher levels, it created a scenario where it seemed like sometimes folks were scared or uneasy about spending their resources. And that's the trope and classic thing of like, especially if you're a JRPG fan, where you're like, all right, I have this elixir, and if I just save up like 99 elixirs by the end of the game, I'll be real set for the final fight. Comes to the final fight, hey, you're looking pretty hurt and you need to heal yourself. Are you going to use those elixirs? No. I need to save them when I need them. It's the last fight. Yeah, I know, but there could be something worse later, right? And it's like, no, spend it, damn it. Do the thing. Do the fucking thing already. And it feels like the system wanted to lean into that. And that's something I appreciated as well. That the system wants you to be like, have fun, do cool things, like enjoy yourself. You don't have to treat this as like an antagonistic, the GM is actively going to kill you. I mean, I will, but that's more a happenstance than intention.
Yeah, that should be a result of the fun being had. You know, one of my core personal philosophies when GMing is like and it's a thing I wrote implicitly into Ether, is that I hate denial in terms of I hate using counterspell against players. I hate using things like anti-magic against players. But I hate doing them only when it takes away the player's ability to do a cool thing. If me using them is a cool thing and it doesn't impact them doing a cool thing, I will be vicious with it. But that's sort of why you'll notice, like, in Ether, you know, you brought up the idea that, like, everybody was having fun with risks. And that's just sort of a result of the idea of, yeah, because you know you can take the risk and you won't feel bad if it doesn't work out right away. Because you have alternatives to, you know, still facilitate your fun at the table individually and as a group. Whereas in sort of a pass fail system like D&D, where your resources are tied to resting and like time in game, there's that idea of like, oh yeah, I want to do a cool thing but I don't have the resources for it, or I want to do the cool thing and the dice says no. And it's like, there are ways around that. Narrating it but it's a lot easier to get around that when the system says, all right, you do the cool thing, you're just gonna get popped in the nose for it. Or you do the cool thing and it's going to go horribly wrong. Uh, just all that kind of thing. So I'm glad to see that really came out for you, Angela, because that was a big kind of focus for me, not explicitly, but trying to just establish circumstances for that with the system.
It delivered.
And isn't that just great to hear? It delivered. That the system did what you wanted it to do, and it actually delivered in action.
Now I get to not be stressed out about other people running the game.
Amazing.
Because that's the thing, is like, it's one thing to have other people run it privately. It's a whole other story to have someone say, yeah, I want to use this on a stream. And it's like, okay, go ahead, have fun.
And I do get the impression that we did have a lot of fun with the system on the stream. I mean, the fact that we're getting together here to talk about the game, talk about that little campaign, shows that the system really facilitated a fun and dramatic story. And I'm also glad to see from both of you here in this conversation this excitement you have for it, this love that comes from it. And that's really great to bring the two of you here together to talk about it. Unfortunately, we are slowly coming to an end of this conversation. But before we go out, I do have one final question for both of you. It's one of my hypothetical questions. Last time, for example, I asked Eric what he would do if he could go in a time machine back to see his past self and give them some advice on what they should do different. This time, it's a bit of an easier hypothetical question. Hypothetically speaking, let's say there would be a second chapter of Seekers of the Heart, and there would be more story to come there. I would like to hear from Eric what kind of mechanics of the game he would love to see more highlighted, or like see a bit more in action. And from Angela, what kind of part of Umbra could be more explored, or where the narrative could go. Just a little bit of an idea, just a little bit of where this narrative could still go. And I'm going to start out with Eric. Is there any part of the mechanics, could be even something as little as one of the character options, one of the powers the characters could have? Is there anything that you would like to see how it plays out at a table?
So one of the things I'm doing with this updated version is taking a lot of like the expansion materials I've had floating around and just putting them into the core book. So it'll be a beefier core rules, but it'll also just sort of incorporate things that I think are fun. Some of the stuff in that are going to be aura abilities. So looking at you paladins, and the idea of how they interact with the card bank is you quote unquote freeze a suit. So the concept of concentration becomes, all right, for the period of time you are keeping this ability up, you cannot have cards of that particular suit go into or out of the card bank. It is locked for that one suit or two suits or whatever. So you could potentially have 4 concentration effects going at once, but it locks out your entire card bank. So I would be really fascinated to see just how busted characters get with that, and also just how busted it would get with the narrator having a card bank as well. The other thing I'd love to see is just, if there was a second chapter, watching the bonds come into play a lot more. Having more of those, yeah, I know a guy moments, just to get, little tastes of life around Umbra and little tastes of how the players slot into not just this role of doing a specific job, but the role of, yeah, we exist in a society. that sort of thing. Damn it, camera.
Awesome.
So what you're saying is you want to have more moments of people acknowledging we live in a society. I see.
No, I just want to have more excuses for you to create hot NPCs to interact with.
Does my capybara, does my mecha capybara Moogle not satisfy you enough?
I mean, it's not
Okay.
my thing personally, but
Furries are
people
screaming at you right now. But in all honesty, if I were thinking about a second chapter to this, sort of the way that I was thinking about ending the story and giving like a glimpse of what could come ahead, that whole mention of the like floating islands being seen far off in the distance, that was something that I told my players. I'm like, I'm just gonna give you like a glimpse of what could happen later on, because in actuality, part of me has thought that like this is Umbra is its own world, like the setting and everything is its own place. But I started to have the idea of like, well, what if this is a location in another one of my worlds that I've created? Because I built a world that was specifically Numenera focused. Like whenever, like I said before, I try out a new system, I try and make a world that's founded on some of the principles or allowing the mechanics to flesh out that world. And that world of floating islands had at one given point had different ages. It had different eras of exploration. And the quote unquote world below came to be a place during certain eras of that world that was no longer traveled anymore. People just they saw fog banks take over the whole land below, and then no one really explored there anymore because anyone who went to go explore never came back. So in my head, I had sort of imagined what would it be like to do the nice like season 2 does a throwback to season 1 thing of like, what if you start in the world of the floating islands, their hub world, their islands, that their job is to go try and explore, seeing this mountain edifice suddenly piercing the heavens and the fog having pulled back. And what would it be like to go from that world, connecting those two during the same time era, like time period and era, moving it over to be like, yeah, we got to the summit and there's this weird like giant crystal font thing. One of the new player characters touches it and then Sonorum is back with Ultima. Or when they go and they're like, yeah, we went down the layers and there's this weird chaotic woman, or I think she looks kind of like a fish, so maybe she's a siren or something, leading a pirate ship. Like there's that kind of stuff where I love those kinds of throwbacks because it brings me back to being a kid watching season 2 of Digimon, and then they're like, it's the original group of kids, oh my god, it's so amazing. That's sort of what I had in mind for like
that would make an amazing dungeon crawl.
It
just like
don't...
hey, this mountain has shown up, go like see if there's anything there worth like the classic setup of go see if there's anything there worth taking, and then turning around and being like, the mountain is not a mountain, the mountain is like multiple nations.
Yes, it's multiple, it's collectivist cultures that have all formed because no one went outside for whole generations. And it would all, and the logic for why folks from the world above wouldn't have known the folks from the world below and why the folks in Umbra wouldn't go outside would be consistent. It would be coherent. It would be the sense of like, why don't you go and why wouldn't anyone from the world below have gone up to the islands? Because going outside literally burns them. That's kind of a deterrent to exploration when your skin begins scalding the moment you go outside. It's folks don't like that. Usually, depends on the context.
That would be so cool.
That's sort of what I had in mind. It was just giving a taste of like what could be, and that world was very much also inspired by like classic Final Fantasy, like early 1 through 6 kind of versions of like the 4 classic ancient elements, light and dark, and also throwing Horizon Zero Dawn, Skyward Sword, and Wind Waker vibes into it, because why wouldn't you want to be someone riding a giant biomechanical bird? Who among us has not wanted this at least once in their life?
That sounds like an amazing place to go. And together with this little sneak peek of a potential new mechanic for auras we got here, I'm seeing a lot of possibilities coming together. This was a fantastic conversation with both of you. I hardly notice the time even going by. I love it when I talk with people and we can just flow from topic to topic, like linger a little bit on them and then move on to the next. But also, I'm so glad with all that you brought today here to this conversation. Not just to this conversation. Eric, thank you once again for making this game, making Aether, giving us a chance to play it, and for
Thank
also
you for playing it.
for also coming on here and talking about the game. And Angela, thank you for running this game, for creating this world, and also coming here to tell us more about the world you created and just giving us a peek behind the curtain. Personally, as a GM myself, I'm always excited when I get to talk to other GMs and talk about their world building. I could do this for hours, but I'm also glad to just hear from you what the process is behind all of that and how it all came so nicely together in the Seekers of the Heart game. Thanks, both of you, for being here. We're going to slowly wrap up, but before we're going to leave, I want to give both of you a chance to quickly plug yourself here. And I'm just going to start what's in my overlay, the middle of the overlay, starting out with Eric real quick. Eric, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where can we find you? What's up with you?
Yeah, hi. Once again, I'm Eric, aka EldritchCrow on the internet, your resident biomechanical corvid. There is a joke here I'm not going to make because TOS. But yeah, if you're looking for me, look for EldritchCrow on the not quite dead but still bloated corpse of Twitter. You can also find me as EldritchCrow on Twitch. Twitch and Itch, I should say. Haven't streamed in a while, but you can also find links to other things there. You can also find Aether on itch.io. I have been slowly tinkering away on all those updates. I have finally started doing some basic layout for that update too, which is nice progress. So hopefully that'll be out within the next couple of months or before the end of 2023.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Angela, where can we find you? What are you up to?
Hello there, folks. My name, as I said before, is Angela Lemus-Mogrovejo. I use she, her pronouns, and I am involved in a lot of different things. I am, let me see if I can remember all of them. I am a freelance musician, so if you ever are interested in having a theme commissioned for your TTRPG campaign, I am more than willing to do that. I'm currently actually working on one for my raid team for FF14. I need to do that and finish that because they paid me, and I still need to finish it and record it. So I am a freelance musician. I am a game designer. My games, my original game, Flame in the Abyss, that was inspired by the Dark Knight quest from FF14 and more, is available on my itch, Voice of the Phoenix, as well as I think at last count, I'm at 23 playbooks for the Slayers RPG system that were primarily inspired by all of the jobs for FF14, as well as a few other media. And I'm likely going to be adding in 2 more within the next few months that are Castlevania inspired. One that is inspired by the Devil Forge Master, a la Isaac and Hector, as well as a construct that embodies the spirit of our beloved Castlevania trio of heroes. I finally figured out a way to make it work, and I just need to figure out where I left the napkins that I wrote all of it on a plane ride. On a plane trip, because I'm that kind of person, because I didn't bring my notebook. But in terms of play, you can see me over on Fridays for the next, I believe we're still got about 4 more weeks on Girls Run These Worlds, where I believe it's 2 p.m. EST. I don't know what the math is for figuring that out to EU times. I assume it's another 5 hours after that. On Fridays for Ballad of Conjurers, where I play basically my brand logo, which is a phoenix, an anxious phoenix autistic scholar, humanoid of some kind, because Burb is me. And I'm involved with a whole bunch of other groups as we're playing through a world where one of the archangel deities of the world has prevented a lot of these sentient races from being able to have children, and we're dealing with the consequences of that. So that's been a whole thing. And we just fought dinosaurs, I think, last session there. So we're dealing with the aftermath of that. So I'm involved in a lot of different places. I'm a game designer. I'm the creative director for Girls Write These Worlds. I'm a freelance musician. I do a lot of different things. I'm involved in a lot of different stuff. And on the note of poetry and such, I'm also a poet over on Patreon. You can find pretty much everywhere at Phoenix24fm to find me. And as a special treat, that I only ever said this for my players, so I'll say it here too for both of you, for both our delightful creator and interviewer. This was actually a poem that I wrote from the session titles of the entire series. So it is: of shattered shadows and broken memories form the piercing fear of beauty's dominion. Embrace the discord, reject the dragon's will, scale to the heavens, and find paradise lost. And pretty much that was something that that's also a thing that I do. Being a poet, you start using the skill wherever you can. And one of the things was, I'm just going to make a poem out of session titles because anime titles, and I'm a dork and a nerd. But that's me.
All right. Once again, thanks to both of you. Here on Heart of Tales, we will be back coming Tuesday, because we will be back here on Tuesday with our Convergence Manifesto campaign, the D&D 5th edition game set in Eberron. We took a little bit of a break over June, but we will pick right up on Tuesday as the party is about to fight a bunch of many-eyed aberrations from the plane of Zoriat in Eberron. So if you want to see how they deal with that and further investigate what one of their rivals is up to by commencing some kind of planar convergence, maybe even writing a manifesto about it. Who knows? The secrets might be in the title. Check out us over here back on Horde of Tales. Thanks everyone for dropping by. Thanks again to Eric and Angela for being here. Take care everyone. Stay safe. And we'll see you soon again. Bye-bye.
Bye everyone.